this is the part about TTG, the travel group. So basically what Steve decided to do was just duplicate what he was doing when he was working for GTA, Group Tour and Associates. This is the travel group, TTG. So that's what they were going to do, basically do the same thing that they were doing at GTA. So basically what they had to do was they had to market to customers, they had to groups, they had to put together marketing materials. Like, remember, this is back in 1973, so you had to print up brochures, you had to mail them out to these different groups. The salespeople would go out and talk to people in these groups. They would have to make large financial commitments for airplane. They'd have to commit to a charter plane, to hotel rooms. When you get over there, there's ground transportation. You basically take these people around in tours with buses for meals sometimes. And so they had to put all that stuff together, which was pretty substantial work to put those packages together. And so then they would market those packages to these individual groups through through mass mailings, which were expensive to do because you got to print the stuff out and mail it out, and then they had direct salespeople who would contact that group. Basically, Steve got 50% of the company, Alan got 25%, and then there was another 25% that was basically available for financial investors. Okay, and again, like I talked about, these were back-to-back tours that made it so the charter planes were less expensive. The charter planes were lower cost than traditional airlines. Literally, you would book the same trip for like going to Hawaii for 3 months in a row every week, and the planes would fly from New York to Hawaii, drop people off, and pick up the people that just finished their tour and bring them back. So that's why they were saving so much money on these plane flights. Okay, and so basically they had big upfront costs because they had to, every time they planned a new tour, they would have to put all the marketing materials, all the brochures and everything together for these tours and mail them out, and their salespeople would have to contact the people at these different organizations. So there was quite a bit of upfront cost before you would get the money for the tour. Okay, but they got the deposits for the tours in advance. Typically they would get the money from anywhere from a deposit 90 days in advance to I think 45 days in advance they had to have the money by or something like that. Whereas they had the upfront marketing cost, then they would collect all the money, and then they would have to pay it out to the airlines later on, and to the hotels even later than that, hotels and ground transportation. So you'd have a big cash flow going out up front when you started the marketing for these tours. Then you would get a big cash flow in when you were collecting the deposits, and then you'd have another cash flow out when you're paying for the airlines later on and then for the hotel rooms. So there's basically 3 cycles. The upfront cost, cash out. The in-between, you get the deposits, cash in. And then paying for the airplanes and the ground transportation and the hotel rooms and the meals, cash out. So it was a continuous cycle like that. Okay, so their financing strategy was basically, although he'd consulted in businesses, he wasn't really, his strong suit was not getting the financing, even though he was involved with some of that. One thing he did talk about on page 8, we're on page 8 now, is that structurally these investments sometimes ended up as a combination of debt and equity. This might be a loan with stock warrants. So basically what a loan with stock warrants is say these guys are trying to raise $250,000. So the guy goes, I'm not going to put $250,000 in equity in because that's money that just goes into the company. As the company goes under, he's lost all $250,000. And he might want to just not loan him the money because that's a risky loan, because remember, this is a startup company. They got no sales, no revenues, and they were valuing the company at $1 million because they were asking for $1 a share, and Steve got 500,000 shares, Alan got 250,000 shares, and they were offering 250,000 more shares at $1 a share. Well, that's $1 million $1 million valuation. But $1 million valuation is a lot more money in 2016. I'm going to send you a little link to a website that you can plug in a number for whatever year, and it tells you what it's worth nowadays, or any other year. So from $1 million in 1973 is equivalent to 5.5 million now. So that's what they were valuing the company at, $1 million in 1973 dollars, or $5.5 million in today's money. They were asking for $250,000, which in today's money is equivalent to 1.4 million. They were trying to get someone to invest. So that kind of gives you the idea of it. So a loan would be kind of risky because they have no hard assets to collateralize. They have no sales. They have no revenues. It's a startup company. So a loan but if the company does the way they say it's going to do, it has a good cash flow. So a loan with stock warrants basically works this way. Say if you gave them a 250 as a venture capitalist, you gave them a $250,000 loan at prime plus 2%, the prime lending rate plus 2%. And then on top of that, you also got 15 or 20% of the company in the form of stock warrants. So the stock warrants, sometimes they're confused with calling stock options. Stock warrants basically says you can buy a certain amount of stock from the company at a certain price for a certain period of time. So say in this case you wanted you were going to loan them $250,000 at prime plus 2% to be repaid in like 5 years. Okay, so the cash flow should be able to repay that. And then you get a stock warrant saying that I've got the opportunity, I don't have to, but I've got the opportunity to buy another 200,000 shares at $1 a share for the next 3 years. So that doesn't mean I have to buy it, but it means I could buy it. So if from your standpoint, unless I execute those warrants, if I never execute those warrants, you've given up no equity, you've gotten a loan. From the lender's standpoint, not only did I get a loan where I'm getting a pretty high percentage rate, I've got a chance to buy into the company at a really low price. You're buying at $1 a share, which is the initial shares price, and they may be $5 a share 3 years from now. So you'd be buying for $1 a share from the company, and you'd be able to turn around and sell in the market for $5 a share. So that's what's called an equity kicker. So it's a loan with an equity kicker. So stock warrants are basically the right to purchase stock at a certain price from the company. Options are different. Options are traded on the open market, where somebody puts up stock that they own and saying you can buy it at a certain price for a certain period of time. You either do or you don't, or you can just sell the options. But warrants are stock that you buy from the company directly, so that's a little bit of difference. So he was saying that he structured some of his investments that way back when he was with IM, Innovative Management, that consulting company. Okay, so bottom line though is he was having problems getting any financing from anybody. Venture capitalists, banks didn't want to touch him. Banks didn't want to touch him because banks make loans. And there was nothing to collateralize these loans with. And it was a startup company. There's no hard assets that they were buying with the money where the bank could take the building back or the land back or the equipment back and sell it for at least part of their money. This was a service-oriented business. So they're really not buying anything. There's no big capital expenditures for any hard assets. It's all just money to get the business going. Okay, so banks didn't want to lend to them because they had no revenue, no customers, no hard assets. They did find one, and guys didn't want to. The venture capitalists just didn't think the risk was worth it. There was a fuel and oil problem back in those days where the supplies were being threatened because of wars, and so I'm on page 9 now. And so people were really nervous about that. All of a sudden, fuel is a big cost of flying airplanes. So all of a sudden, either they can't get the fuel and planes would get cut back on their flights, or the fuel got really expensive to make it too expensive for people to want to fly. So that was a huge risk on top of the fact they have no customers, no revenues, no hard assets to collateralize. And he was offering $250,000 for $250,000. He wanted a buck a share, which was basically valuing the company at $1 million, which was equivalent at today's price of $5.5 million for a company with no revenues, no customers, no hard assets. So you can see how risky it is, even for venture capitalists. So a good balance would be to make a loan with, for a venture capitalist to make a loan with warrants, so they could get some equity if it worked out. One bank did offer to make him a loan, but it wasn't. It was a line of credit. Line of credit basically you can use it or not use it. A loan, you take the money and you're on the hook for that money. Line of credit's saying you can basically you can use up to so much of this money. The You don't have to, but it's always there for you, and it can be a revolving line of credit where it renews every year or something like that. So basically, he had no investors that wanted to take his deal from venture capitalists. He had one guy that was maybe going to might provide $20,000, and another guy that told Stephen to come. This is on page 10. Told Stephen to come back when he gets more of the offering, from other people. When he gets more money from other people, he might put in. But so this one bank did offer him a line of credit of $125,000 with the condition that it would be up to $125,000, but they would match dollar for dollar every dollar of equity put in. So if they had $0 of equity, there would be zero line of credit. They had $125,000 of equity, there'd be another $125,000 line of credit for $250,000. So that was one offer he had from one bank, and what they were basically basing it on, I think, was that they were a bank that was looking for deposits. The projections on the cash flow sheet shows that there's good cash flow, which means that they'd be depositing it with this bank. I'm sure that was a condition too, that TTG, the travel group, would bank with this bank. Deposits would be going into this bank. So that was what they had offered to them. Steve was really concentrating on putting these packages together, for the trips and getting the organization up and running, and really not concentrating enough on getting the financing, because that's really what he needed. So they were basically, Steve and Alan were financing this themselves. They were working out of his apartment first. They'd hire a secretary and an additional salesperson, but they were basically paying, and then they eventually rented a little office in his building too. But they were paying for this out of pocket. They spent $10,000 in their own cash between the two of them. I'm on page 12 now. They spent $10,000 in cash between the two of them, and each one of them had run their American Express credit cards up to $15,000 each. So they had $10,000 in cash, $30,000 in credit cards. They had $40,000 into this business, and it was December, so they had to, and they really had to get some financing so they could, he was projecting back on one of the earlier pages that they'd have like $150,000 in cash spent before the first customer deposits were in, and so he really needed this cash to make the financial commitments that they had to make up front. So basically, where this ends, it says, what now? He basically hasn't been able to raise the $250,000 that he needs. Does he go back to friends? Does he try to get smaller amounts from people? What does he do? It says at the end here on page 13 I'm on right now, in deciding on the last-ditch strategy, Steve also contemplated whether he should change his offering to be more attractive. Pricing had never been explicitly discussed with the institutional venture firms, which is bizarre that he never. Shark Tank, they talk about price, quickly. When talking to wealthy investors, Stephen was offering to sell 250,000 shares. So remember, he was keeping 500, and Alan was keeping 750. Steve was keeping 500,000 shares. Alan was keeping 250,000 shares. So Steve and Alan had 750,000 shares. They were offered to sell another 250,000 shares at a buck a share. So there would be a total of 1 million shares at a buck a share value. He was valuing the company at $1 million, which again at today's 5.5 million for a company with no revenues, no customers, no hard assets as collateral. And this 250,000 in today's numbers is worth about 1.4 million. So they're asking for quite a bit of money for a company with no customers, no revenues. So basically, they wanted to figure out what they need to do. So the next portion is we'll go over their financial statements and their what they were pitching to people.